right. I think we're set and ready to go. Glad that you're here. Welcome. If you are joining us for the first time or for the first time in a while, a reminder to you that if you have a question or a comment, the Q&A feature is the best way to share it. I might not respond right away, but that allows me to see your comment and then address it in an appropriate moment. So I do hope you'll share your own insights, comments, and questions. If you're watching live on YouTube, we're really glad that you are here, and you are welcome to join in the discussion if you want to follow the link provided in the chat. It's from the St. Paul's website. There's a Zoom webinar link, and you can join us there so that I can see your questions and your comments, but really glad that you are with us. Let's start with a prayer, and then we will talk about Christology, whatever that is, and in particular, 4 titles that we usually ascribe to Jesus. Let's start with a prayer. Gracious and loving God, thank you for your Son, Jesus, our Redeemer, our Savior. And thank you for this season of Advent in which we prepare ourselves in order to receive him at that great and glorious day, that day of judgment. Help us know who it is that we are following, who it is that we acclaim as Lord, and guide us in our faith and in our study of you. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. So Christology, I don't know if you know anything about Christology or if that's a strange word to you, but I presume that you can figure out that it has to do with Christ, and like most ologies is a study of Christ. But in particular, Christology is that branch of theology that deals with the messianic identity, the Christ identity of Jesus. And it arises maybe most clearly when we consider it in relation to, perhaps in contrast with, the Jesus of history. So if you were to have been a fly on the Palestinian wall when Jesus was born, when Jesus was taken to the temple, when Jesus was preaching or gathering with his disciples, what would that Palestinian fly have seen or heard? What would history have shown? Not the question of faith, but the question of history, kind of the academic historical question. Who is Jesus of Nazareth? The search for or the quest for a historical Jesus has been an important part of theological development. The question of how much of what Jesus is recorded to have said belongs to Jesus, and how much of that is based on the Spirit-inspired or conscious intention of his followers, his disciples, and the future church. So that's part of our sort of the posit or the framework for it, is to distinguish between those historical questions and what indeed do we say from the perspective of Jesus's identity from the perspective of faith. What does it take for us to acclaim Jesus as Christos, an anointed one, a Messiah, or Kyrios, Lord, or as we're going to talk about today, the Son of Man, or as we often say, the Son of God. Those are the 4 titles I want to look at in the series. And the tension, though not necessarily conflict, between what would a fly on the wall have understood and what does the church, after the life of Jesus and the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus have occurred, what do we now understand to be true? In the same way, perhaps this is an image that will help. Think about a relative, someone dear to you, someone who has died, whether that's a parent or a sibling or a spouse, maybe a grandparent, or it could be a more distant relative, or perhaps a good friend. And think about that person who has died, and think about, if you can, even briefly, the last time you were with that person before that person died. If you knew that person was near death, perhaps that visit, that exchange, took on deep significance. If you didn't know, if you didn't expect that person was going to die, I wonder if some deep significance to that last visit was only identified after that person had died. When we look back and think of that story that our loved one told us, or the conversation that we had that seemed at the time to be just an ordinary conversation, but now that we recognized that it was the last time we would be with that person, those words carry new weight. Even though the words are the same, what they express to us and how we receive them is different. That's the distinction between the historical Jesus, the study of the historical Jesus, and the question of Christology. What is the Jesus of faith, the Jesus, the Christ? What do we know about and say about that? It's also Christology is kind of the systematic study of how is it that we come to understand those things about Jesus. How much of them are based on what Jesus would have said or done? How much of them are based on what his contemporaries would have understood? And how much of them are based on what we understand now with God's help looking back? So I'm kind of digging into that a little bit in this series. And as we do that, I'd like to spend a little time talking about why these titles, these terms, these labels that we use perhaps have more significance than we ordinarily ascribe to them. How might a closer, more in-depth, a deep study of these titles, these labels, how might that help us understand why we use them and when we use them, what we mean by them even more? How might it strengthen our faith? That's always the question that I'm holding up for us. So this is the first of a 4-week series on the titles we give to Jesus. There are lots of titles, and I'm not going to cover all of them. I'm really just going to focus on 4 of them. In particular, I'm taking as my guide for the structure, not necessarily the content, but the structure of this series called, it's a book, it's an older book, an early, well, maybe a middle 20th century book by C.F.D. Moule, a British theologian, Charlie Moule, quite the biblical scholar, wrote an interesting commentary on Revelation. But this is his work called The Origins of Christology, and he starts by labeling these sort of 4 terms, 4 titles. So I'm using this as kind of the structure. I'm using other texts, and I'll refer to them as we go along. But 4 titles: this week, Son of Man; next week, Son of God; the week after that, Christ, Christos; and the week after that, Lord, or Kurios. And we'll talk a little bit about the Greek for each of them, but we'll also talk more about what the theological weight of them would be in Jesus's day, and what we understand them to be, and how we might be able to connect those bits. Does that sound like a good approach? If you're participating on the webinar, share your comments and questions anytime. Use the Q&A feature to let me know what's on your mind, and I'll incorporate that into our discussion. But again, I'm really glad that you're here. So today we're talking about Son of Man. Let me start by asking, when you hear that phrase, Son of Man, and I use that, it certainly is masculine centered and masculine specific, but we'll talk more about why. But Son of Man, when you hear that phrase, Son of Man, what images does it bring to mind? What's the setting? What's the connection that you already make between the title, the label Son of Man, and who Jesus was and is, and maybe we would say would be? How do you understand that title, Son of Man? What are your remembrances of that? How do you associate that word with your own faith? What do you hear there? Are there any Bible passages that come to mind? Any context that you would share? If you're watching on the YouTube, we're glad you're here. But if you'd like to share your questions or comments, join us in the Zoom webinar. You can find a link provided in the chat. But any remembrances of Son of Man? I'll wait for your reflections, your comments. But let me share a story of my own. When I was in Cambridge studying to be a priest, in the second year of my studies, I took a class called something like the New Testament and Christology, the real focus on this subject in particular. And the person who supervised my work, my individual tutor is the Oxford term, but my supervisor is the Cambridge term, was Graham Stanton. Graham Stanton, a legendary New Testament scholar and theologian. I was required to buy this book in my course work, but this is his book called The Gospels and Jesus. That's another book that I'm using for the series. But Graham Stanton, part of the supervisor model is you spend the whole year getting ready for your finals. And there's only one grade that matters for your course, only one grade, and it's your final exam. And you don't know, of course, what the questions will be, but you know more or less what the topics will be. And if the subject is Christology, you can bet you need to do some research about Son of Man and Son of God and Christ and Lord and those kind of questions, and the tension between the historical Jesus and the Jesus of faith and the like. So I met about once a week for about 8 or 10 weeks with Graham Stanton, and he gave this warning. He said, when it's time for you to take your final exam, when you're sitting in the exam room and you get the exam, if you see any question that has, because you get to pick which questions you want to answer. Some are mandatory, but a lot of times you've got choices. You're writing longhand essay responses to whatever prompts you're given. He said, whenever you sit down and get your exam, if you see any question that has anything to do with the Son of Man, skip it, avoid it, do not answer it. Son of Man is too complicated. It's too difficult. There are too many layers. You do not attempt to answer that question. Answer another one. No matter how poorly prepared you are, you will not do well if you do Son of Man, which quite a intimidating answer. Uh, let me tell the second half of that story. Graham Stanton was diagnosed with prostate cancer while we were in Cambridge, and he was supposed to be the lecturer, the preacher in one of the local Cambridge colleges, a college where I was affiliated. And he was supposed to be the preacher and lecturer on the subject, Son of Man. But because of his cancer diagnosis, he was not able to do it. Well, the chaplain called me and asked me if I would like to fill in, letting me know that I did not need to try to step into Graham Stanton's shoes, this legend's shoes, but instead to preach on whatever I wanted to that day. It was a last minute. I had about 2 or 3 days worth of notice. But I thought, you know what, I'm gonna try my best. I'm gonna try to preach a sermon on the Son of Man. I gave it my best shot. It wasn't great, and I knew it wasn't great. But on the way out the door, one of the other tutors, one of the other members of the faculty, came up to me and he shook my hand and he looked me in the eye and he said, "Nice try," and kept walking. And I was just gutted, right? The student who's one of my sort of mentors and supervisors, all he could say about my sermon was "nice try." So I say that as a warning. Like, we are not going to pin down or nail down Son of Man. It's too much. It's too complicated. Graham Stanton in his book even acknowledges that it's only fair to skirt the issue. You can't really plumb it with any kind of depth. But Son of Man, a Kristen acknowledges that she thinks of human when she hears Son of Man. I think that's perfect. And I think for the most part in the biblical tradition, whenever we hear Son of Man, we might as well say another person, a human, son of a human, mortal one. In some translations of the Bible, we would see capital H, capital O, human one. It's just another way to say mortal. The way that son of a man, if you're the son of a man, then by golly, you're also a man. Or if you're the child of a human, you're also a human being yourself. Yeah, absolutely. That's part of the context. Any other remembrances that you've got about Son of Man? Well, the reason I'm starting with Son of Man is because Advent is a season in which we hear particular words about the Son of Man. And last Sunday in church, we heard as our gospel lesson a part of Mark chapter 13, when Jesus tells his hearers, his disciples, that the Son of Man will come in great power and will be seated on the clouds. And Jesus seems to use, at least in Mark 13 and in parallel texts in other gospel accounts, Jesus seems to at times imply that the Son of Man is this end of the world figure, this apocalyptic figure. And we're going to build upon that tradition. But we hear a fair amount about the Son of Man during Advent. And so that's one of the reasons that I was interested in doing this series at all. So Son of Man is a good Advent theme. And that led to Christology. Also, we will hear in some of our Old Testament passages that we call the one to be born, the wonderful counselor, mighty God, Prince of Peace, everlasting Father, right? That handle, right? The chorus, the text is rolling around in our mind. The music is rolling around in our mind, right? So lots of labels that get attributed to Jesus during this season of Advent as we anticipate Christmas. But also, with the case of Son of Man, when we anticipate the return of Jesus, the second coming of Jesus, the second advent of Jesus, hence the term Advent for the season. The other reason I think it's important to start with Son of Man is because Jesus called himself, or seems to have called himself, Son of Man frequently. Jesus hardly ever, if ever, referred to himself as the Son of God. Jesus hardly ever, if ever, referred to himself as the anointed one of God, the Christ, the Messiah. Jesus never referred to himself as Lord except obliquely when quoting from the Psalms. How then is it David called him Lord, right? Not even referring to himself in the first person, but in the third person. We make the connections after the fact, but isn't it strange? Isn't it interesting that so many of the labels and the titles that we give to Jesus without thinking about it are titles that Jesus wouldn't have used for himself, that there's no record of Jesus using those titles for himself. Jesus doesn't say, hey, everybody, I'm the Messiah, welcome me, or I'm the Son of God you've been waiting for. Jesus doesn't use those titles, but he does seem to use Son of Man. Part of our challenge is to figure out when he's using the term Son of Man and when other people are kind of labeling him as Son of Man, and what's the difference? We'll talk more about that in the coming weeks when we notice titles that Jesus didn't attribute to himself. So Son of Man is of particular interest because it seems to be a self-referential title, a title that Jesus indeed would use to describe himself and his ministry. But what does that mean? Is it, as Kristen suggests, does it just mean I'm another person? A human one, I'm another mortal? Or does Jesus use that with that kind of Son of Man coming in the clouds language? And that's what I want to talk about today. Let's look then at some texts from the Bible, and we're going to skim through a fair number of texts and then see where it goes. If my image is covering the text, then you can let me know in the chat, or perhaps you can move it yourself. I'm not sure if that's possible on your screen or not, but I'm going to try to make sure that you can read the text. But these are a few isolated verses where the term Son of Man is used in the New Testament and also in the Old Testament. And we'll look at one non-testamental, non-canonical text and then talk a little bit about it. But let's start with the New Testament. When we hear Son of Man, what does Jesus have in mind? What do his followers have in mind? Let's start, of course, with the gospel accounts. And I want to start in Matthew chapter 8. This is a line that we see Jesus say, and I bet we remember it, though the Son of Man distinction might not be something that we call to mind. But this is from Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 18. Now, when Jesus saw great crowds around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. A scribe then approached him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Another of his disciples said to him, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. We could preach a whole sermon or a whole Bible study on verse 22, let the dead bury their own dead. What gave Jesus the authority to make such a challenging interpretation of the Jewish law, the tradition where the requirement to bury your own father is paramount? But that's another conversation for another day, though not unrelated. I want to talk about the Son of Man reference in verse 20. Jesus says, Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. What does that mean? What is Jesus telling us? He's not even using the first person. Is Jesus talking about himself? Is he talking about somebody else? Is he talking about someone else? How do you hear that? Don't try to be a biblical scholar. Don't worry about whether you know the answer. There isn't one answer. I'm really curious in what you hear. How do you hear that phrase by Jesus? Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. If you were going to rephrase that, if you were going to interpret that Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, what would you use? How would you describe that? What do you think Jesus meant by the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head? Do you think he was talking about himself? Do you think he was talking about someone else? When we start referring to ourselves in the third person, we become a whole nother level of important or self-important, right? But what does Jesus mean by that? Do you have any insights? It seems to be a fairly ordinary thing to say. I don't know enough about the text to know that was a common sort of aphorism or a parable or a saying that Jesus's contemporaries would have used about foxes and birds. Um, but it seems to be describing just a human being and a particular kind of human being, right? Um, it, Kristen makes an important link, I think, and that's kind of where I am. That is he referring to himself? It seems like at least initially he's referring to himself, but he's responding to somebody's question, and so maybe he's referring to himself and to his followers or to others, and maybe to humanity in general. There's a Jesus has a vision of himself and his relationship to others, and the Son of Man seems to have something to do with it. You know, uh, is Jesus warning the scribe, saying, "You can follow me if you want, but I don't really have anywhere to go," or is he also saying, "I don't have a place to lay my head, but you don't either, or you wouldn't either"? To what extent is that? It's kind of a reciprocal invitation. Um, it seems to be referring to a sort of his humanity, his mortality, but in a particular way. Julie suggests that humanity isn't meant to be on Earth forever. Yeah, it already has in mind this kind of this otherworldliness or this eternity, this eternal framework in which Jesus is speaking not only about this earthly life but the other. And so when the scribe says, "I'll follow you wherever you go," maybe indeed he's saying, "I'm not going to be around for all that long. You can't," as John's gospel account would tell us, "where I'm going, you cannot follow." Maybe there's an element of that as well. So Jesus, sometimes he uses Son of Man in ways that seem to talk about his humanity, although those seem to have a link to something else, either his otherworldliness or to his identity as a kind of a leader of a group, or there's something about following him that draws out. But if you read through many examples in the gospel accounts, when Jesus refers to himself seemingly as Son of Man, he seems to be just talking about himself as a person, as a human being, who in this case doesn't stay in the same place for very long. If you're going to follow me, I hope you've got good shoes, because we're going to be doing a lot of walking, and we're not going to be in the same place twice. That kind of itinerant mentality. Yeah, let's fold in another understanding. And this is from Matthew chapter 9. This is paralleled also in Luke chapter 2, but there's a turn of phrase at the end of Matthew 9 that I really like. So I wanted to read from Matthew 9. And I bet you'll remember this miracle as well, but I bet, like me, you might have forgotten about the reference to the Son of Man. So let's read from Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. "And after getting into a boat, he," that is Jesus, "crossed the sea and came to his own town. And just then, some people were carrying a paralyzed man lying on a bed. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, 'Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven.' Then some of the scribes said to themselves, 'This man is blaspheming.' But Jesus, perceiving their thoughts, said, 'Why do you think evil in your hearts? For which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, stand up and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins,' he then said to the paralytic, 'Stand up, take your bed, and go to your home.' And he stood up and went to his home. When the crowd saw it, they were filled with awe, and they glorified God, who had given such authority to human beings." I remember Mark's version of the story, right? The friends sort of make a hole in the roof because the house was so crowded, and they let their friend down by ropes on his bed. It's perhaps a more visually or physically kind of a more visceral story to imagine, kind of being on a mat while people are trying to lower it down from the roof. We don't get that bit, but what we do get in Matthew's account is that very end line, that the crowds are amazed that God had given such authority to human beings, plural, to humans. I wonder what the connection is, and just join me in marveling at the connection between "so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth," who had given such authority to human beings. So it could be that all Jesus is saying is, so that you may know that human beings have authority on earth to forgive sins, take up your bed and walk. And the people were amazed he had such authority. So Son of Man in verse 6 could just be I'm a human being just like you, Jesus perhaps could have said, and just like me, you too have the authority to forgive sins. That begins down a sort of a track or a road that isn't reflective of our faith, but I wonder if that's part of it. Or on the other side of that, and you'll see in this translation, Son of Man is capital S, capital N, Son of Man. It's an imported title. So he has this authority, and the crowds are amazed that anybody would have this authority, this particular mortal, this particular human being. What an interesting play. Jesus seems to be using the term Son of Man to kind of bridge that gap between his humanity and also his divine work. And if you look through the gospel accounts, you'll see that Jesus often uses the phrase Son of Man to talk about his ministry on earth. This is what the Son of Man has come to do. The Son of Man has come to do this. The Son of Man is here to do that. But in those ways, he seems to be emphasizing the significance of his earthly ministry as a human being, and yet also as an agent of God. That agency is an important content of the concept of Son of Man, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So let me fold in another example. Again, if you've got questions or comments, do not hesitate to share them. But this is from later in the same chapter. Notice we're still, excuse me, I take that back. We're in Mark 9. Actually, in Mark 8, we get two Son of Man references. But I chose to go with Mark in this version, so forget that comment. We're not in the same chapter as anything. But here in Mark 9, the second half of Mark 9, this is after Peter's identification of Jesus as Christos, Messiah. We'll talk about that 2 weeks from today. But this is from Mark 9, and Jesus is traveling with his disciples. And listen to this Son of Man reference, and let's fold in another concept, another idea into the Son of Man picture that we're building or we're making. They, that is Jesus and his disciples, went on from there and passed through Galilee. That's Jesus's home territory. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and while he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." So the Son of Man bit is just in the first half, but I think the second paragraph and the first paragraph speak to each other, and I kind of wanted to hold that up for us. But let's start with the first paragraph. This time Jesus refers to the Son of Man, and it's pretty clear that he's talking about himself, not about some future participant, some future prophet, but he seems to be referring to himself again, third person. He doesn't say, "I'm the Son of Man," but his disciples surely know what he is saying. And so he says, what about the Son of Man? That the Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands. They will kill him, and after 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. There's something about the path that Jesus is on that, as Son of Man, also involves suffering and involves obedience. If you read all the way through the gospel accounts, you get a clear sense that Jesus is in control of the path that he is on, even though at the end of his journey, he will be killed in Jerusalem. The gospel writers go out of their way to let us know that Jesus knew it and he pursued it willingly, if not eagerly. So there's a sense in which Jesus is not surprised, according to the gospel accounts, that he was killed at the hand of the Romans, but instead accepts that fate, welcomes it, steers a course toward it. And yet there's something about that Son of Man identity that is to be suffering and also to be obedient. There's an obedient suffering to this concept of Son of Man. I think we take that for granted. I think we take for granted that Jesus is going to suffer and die and that he's the obedient one. But I don't often think about associating those terms, those concepts with the label or the term, the title Son of Man. And yet that's a lot of what that is. So when Jesus talks about himself as Son of Man, part of what he means is the obedient one, the faithful one, and also the one who's obedient even in the face of suffering and death. There's something about that. In a minute, we're going to look at the Old Testament concepts, and we'll see perhaps where Jesus and his contemporaries would have pulled that from. But let me read Mark 13 again. This is the part we heard in last Sunday's gospel lesson, and then let me hear from you what you see or what you notice in any of these readings. This is another Son of Man reference. This is from Mark 13, starting in verse 24. But in those days, after that suffering, Jesus says, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near, and you can remember perhaps the rest of that. That as soon as you see this, he is very near, even at the gates. But notice how this, what role does this Son of Man play? But there's something triumphant. Jesus didn't come in clouds. He came born to a virgin Mary, a carpenter Joseph, born in Bethlehem in a stable, or at least placed in a manger because there was no room in the inn. So that's not clouds, great power and glory. Jesus seems to have something else in mind, and yet he's used Son of Man to refer to himself. And so his hearers and we readers are left asking, how is Jesus folding this in? Now we've got some future understanding. We've got kind of human one, we've got suffering one, we've got obedient one, we've got the human one who has this divine-like authority that catches everybody by surprise and amazes them. And some of this divine invested authority is yet to come, is also what we're waiting for, what we're looking for in Advent. So lots of layers of Son of Man, and I haven't referred to all of them, but I'm wondering, what do you hear? What do you sense? Does any part of this Son of Man language or concept, does any of it surprise you? Are there any bits that you find easier to identify with, and some that you find perhaps perplexing or challenging? How do you hear in the four examples that I've given? How do you hear Son of Man being used? And what about it is new to you? What about it is familiar to you? What about it is puzzling or startling or encouraging? What do you hear there? And we're going to fold it all together, hopefully, by the time we're done in about 25 minutes. So I'm curious where you are now. What are you hearing? For me, these threads are usually disparate. I don't usually associate the suffering one with the one who comes in the clouds. And I don't usually associate the obedient one with the Son of Man that comes in the clouds. And likewise, there's the whole concept of mortal and yet more than mortal. I still find myself trying to kind of figure it all out. Susan suggests that Jesus is evolving. This is second coming. Surely this from Mark 13 is second coming. And Kristen echoes this reference is quite glorious. Absolutely. It's hard to miss the glory being expressed to us in this passage. And although so often I hear the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth being shaken as something really threatening, but as I tried to stress last week, and as I'm really holding on to this year of all years, that reorientation of the world is a very deeply hopeful and promising message for God's people. And if we find this more scary than encouraging, then we might be on the wrong side of judgment, right? But yeah, this is glorious and powerful, and how grand an image, a universal. Suzanne made a wonderful comment in staff meeting now last Tuesday, that when she reads about the sun and the moon and the stars and the heavens, it reminds her of a sort of a return to the creative force. This is God's creative power, universe-wide, universal in that sense, cosmic, a power being displayed. Yes, this Son of Man comes with cosmic power and with cosmic implications. Absolutely. How different that is, it seems to me, from the fox have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. How do we fit those together? How do we find those? Yeah, Susan remembers the galaxy references in one of the Eucharistic prayers is particularly beautiful. Yeah, and it echoes that language for sure. Yeah, but how do we fit them together? That's the kind of the beauty of it. What I love about Son of Man, and probably the reason that my tutor invited me not to answer it, is how do you hold together these things? And I'm sure, and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are moments or events or items or other things, concepts that we use with so many different layers, right? And we get them and we see them. What does it mean to be a child? The child parent image is not only a biological image, it's a nurturing image, it's a relational image. It changes throughout time. It's an evolving image. It means different things at different moments. It means different things to different people. But Son of Man is one of those images that Jesus uses, and it seems to convey so much, sometimes even contradictory passages or concepts, and yet Jesus conveys these to us. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So anyway, so I'm with you. I'm holding on to this, but what I wanted to hold up to you is, if you go, and I'm going to go ahead and let me just show you. If you search in a Bible software, and I love Bible Gateway, really helpful because it allows you to change the version of the Bible, but also to find a passage or search for a word. But if you can see, I've searched for Son of Man, and a lot of these you'll notice. I've gone to John. If you notice, some of these are Son of Manasseh, which of course isn't the right title, Son of Man. So a lot of these you would have to weed out. But notice in Ezekiel, there are 93 times that Son of Man is used. Daniel there too, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute. But look at the New Testament, Matthew. There are 29 times that Matthew uses the phrase Son of Man. Mark 14, Luke 26, John 13. So in the gospel accounts, there are tons of examples in which the gospel writers use the phrase Son of Man to refer to God. Next week, we'll look at how often Son of God is used. But what's peculiar is that if you were to look at all of the 29 times Matthew uses it, you'll see that Jesus is often either being referred to in directly or referring to himself directly as Son of Man. Son of God isn't used very often in the gospel accounts. Christ is used a fair amount. Lord is used a ton of times, but we'll separate that out with a really important distinction that I'll save for a couple of weeks. But Son of Man is Jesus's go-to bit, his go-to label. So, for example, if when Elizabeth and I were dating and even engaged, I was living in England for part of that time, and my friends and colleagues in England had never met Elizabeth, but they heard me describe her and talk about her. But when they heard me describe and talk about her, they heard me use the word Liz, because often I will say to Elizabeth, "Hey, Liz, what about this?" or anything you need, Liz. Nobody, as far as I know, other than me, calls her Liz. It's not a nickname. It's just what I happen to call her, because Elizabeth is 4 syllables. That's a lot of syllables. But when Elizabeth came to visit, all of my friends called her Liz. And she was taken aback by that. Nobody calls her Liz, but all they'd heard me say all this time was Liz. So they rightly, with reason, assumed that was her nickname, but it wasn't. Jesus and his contemporaries thought of him as Son of Man more than any other label. And part of the reason, I think, is because it's multifaceted and it's evolving and it's got different layers. Our challenge is to figure out whether Jesus meant the whole thing, or did Jesus only mean this little bit, and we're adding the layers that Jesus would have found confusing, not foreign, but would Jesus, in the same way that Elizabeth was a little perplexed when people called her Liz, if we used a particular aspect of that Son of Man, if we said Jesus of history, Jesus of Nazareth, when you say Son of Man, you're meaning the one who comes in the clouds, or you're meaning the one who, and he might look at us and say, "That's not really what I had in mind, but I see what you did there." Or maybe he did. So that's kind of our quest, or our question for the rest of today. All right, so let me hold up for you. I'm going to move my little text box, my little picture box. So I've given you 2 translations of the same passage. Ezekiel chapter 2. This is the ESV, the English Standard Version, a more traditional or perhaps you would say conservative version. It uses some masculine, more likely to use masculine specific language. The New Revised Standard Version is the version that we use in church. And if you took part in Laura Walsh's series on the Bible as literature, you might remember her saying that there's no good literary translation of the Bible that is available to us. It just doesn't exist for worship, except she notes Alter's translation. But this is a good example of how translation begins to fail us by trying to convey a clear truth, but losing its connection beyond that. And that's something Laura talked about a lot in terms of a literary reading of the Bible. This is from Ezekiel 2, when Ezekiel, the prophet, is called by God. And God's messenger said to Ezekiel, I'm going to start over here in the ESV version, Son of man, stand on your feet and I will speak to you. And he spoke to me. The Spirit entered me into me and set me on my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. And he said to me, Son of man, I send you to the people of Israel. 93 times Ezekiel uses the phrase Son of Man to refer to himself. But if you'll see how the New Revised Standard Version translates it, same verses, he said to me, O mortal, stand up on your feet and I will speak with you. O mortal, Son of Man does mean mortal one or a human one. But you'll see that the translation committee, the people who are responsible for producing the NRSV, gave us mortal instead of Son of Man because they wanted perhaps to distinguish between Son of Man, capital S, capital M, Jesus usage. We'll see that also in Daniel. And Son of Man meaning mortal, as Ezekiel and some of the Psalms would use it. So they use mortal, but then we lose the connection. We use the layer, the facet, the aspect that Jesus might have meant simply a human one. So isn't it interesting how mortal and Son of Man are the same thing, but they convey something different? And so when Jesus uses Son of Man, does he just mean mortal? Does he mean mortal with a capital M, the mortal of mortals, the capital H, capital O, human one? Or is Jesus just meaning another mortal? And when can we know the difference? And if the language gets shifted, if you only had the NRSV, you might not ever realize that Ezekiel uses Son of Man, so that when Jesus uses it, maybe he has in part Ezekiel's image in mind. Yeah, and Susan notes about capitalized Ezekiel. You'll see that even in the ESV, man is not capitalized. It's just capitalized son because it's the beginning of a sentence. And here in verse 6, you'll see, because it's not at the beginning of a sentence, you'll see that it's not even capitalized at all. Son of man, you might as well say a son of a man. Verse 6, and you, a son of a man, be not afraid of them, mortal one. So maybe the capitalization is a way to distinguish them. When the translation fails us or not, but even then, I wonder what the context is. You might have noticed in Mark 13 that the NRSV gives us this little bit in verse 26. They will see, quote, the Son of Man coming in clouds, end quote. This is an internal quotation to what Jesus is saying. It's hard to imagine Jesus saying, then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds. He's not doing air quotes. There are no quotation marks in the Greek manuscripts. This is purely the commentators helping us see that Jesus isn't just making this up. He's importing some of the Hebrew tradition, some of the Hebrew scriptures into his statement. And here we see in Ezekiel, Son of Man might just mean mortal one. We translate it one way or another, which kind of robs it perhaps of that overlap. Let's look at another passage from the Hebrew Bible, Psalm 80. Psalm 80, a really important text when it comes to understanding Son of Man, because we see a transitional text. This is a text which, kind of like Ezekiel 2, means mortal one, but we can see it's not just a mortal one. Something else is going on. So let me read. This is from towards the end of Psalm 80, starting in verse 14. And I've chosen I've chosen the English Standard Version in order to convey some of that overlap. Verse 14, turn again, O God of hosts. Look down from heaven and see. Have regard for this vine, the stock that your right hand planted, and for the son whom you made strong for yourself. They have burned it with fire. They have cut it down. May they perish at the rebuke of your face. But let your hand be on the man of your right hand, the Son of Man whom you have made strong for yourself. Then we shall not turn back from you. Give us life, and we will call upon your name. Restore us, O Lord God of hosts. Let your face shine, that we may be saved. So we hear this prayer for deliverance, this prayer for God to come and save God's people. Notice the Son of Man language. We've got the Son, we've got man, and we've got Son of Man. But notice how quickly when we go from verse 17 to verse 18, notice that we go from a singular to a plural. Look at these two verses. Let your hand be on the man of your right hand, the Son of Man you have made strong for yourself. Then we shall not turn back from you. Give us life, and we will call upon your name. What's the psalmist mean? What does the poet mean there? Are they the same? Is the Son of Man, the one at the right hand, is that a king-like figure? Is the psalmist saying, God, don't forget your right-hand man, your king, David's descendant, because if you will remember our leader, your leader, then all of us will be good and healthy and happy and prosperous? Or is the poet associating the two? Don't forget the Son of Man whom you made strong for yourself, because we are your son. We are your children, children. And in that poetic way, overlapping singular and plural, it's hard to know. Often, as I wrote about this week in the newsletter, often a prophet will come and speak directly to a king, but not just talking to that leader, but to the people that leader represents. And in this case, I wonder if it's an artificial distinction to separate the Son of Man, whom you have made strong for yourself, and the people who are to be safe and strong, to be filled with life. I wonder to what extent those are the same and to what extent they're different. And I wonder if when Jesus uses Son of Man, if he's also making that connection between the individual Son of Man and the community, the humanity that the Son of Man represents. If you've got comments or questions, I hope you'll share them. I'm going to keep going, but don't let the fact that I move on to another passage of Scripture keep you from sharing your comments. I want to look at one more passage from the Old Testament. This is Daniel 7. Some of you have been taking part in the Rector's Bible Study. It meets on Mondays at 10, and we've been looking at Daniel, and sure enough, tomorrow we will be studying Daniel 7. So if you want to come back for a deeper dive into Daniel 7, not speaking about the Jesus tradition, but in the Hebrew tradition, Daniel 7, come tomorrow, 10 o'clock. You can participate, not on the same link, but on a different link, and that's available through Facebook. Susan Mays notes that the Trinity in the Psalms, right? Yeah. We don't see any explicit Trinitarian references, of course, in the Hebrew Bible. It's a Christian concept, but there we see it. There we see God and Son and Spirit, and we would miss a layer if we tried to only read Trinitarian language. But isn't it wonderful that we can see those Trinitarian evidence? Just like in the beginning, the world was without form and void, and God's Spirit hovered over the waters, and then God spoke, and the Word, and John chapter 1 takes advantage of those Trinitarian echoes, perhaps, in that scripture. Yeah, absolutely, the Trinitarian language. So let me jump to Daniel 7, and I tried to cut this down. I wanted to only read the Son of Man part, but actually, for us to get it, we kind of need to hear more than just the Son of Man part. So let me read, if you'll let me quickly, Daniel chapter 7, starting in verse 1. The Son of Man bit comes towards the end of this passage, but let's listen to the whole thing. Strange. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then, as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were bursting fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions had alarmed of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Don't you love it? Don't you love those bizarre images, those strange images? What do you hold on to there? What are the connections that you see? What do you make out of that? What a terrible, terrifying image of the beasts. If we try to impose upon this text a chronology, we notice four terrifying beasts that do great harm, that destroy, that devour flesh. We know that those beasts are not good. We know that they're bad. They're destroyers. Then we see God, the Ancient of Days, taking God's seat and being worshipped, and the book of judgment is opened. And then there's the strange bit about the Son of Man who's presented to the Ancient of Days. And to this Son of Man, notice in this translation, lowercase s, lowercase n, Son of Man is given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all nations and languages and peoples should serve him, this everlasting dominion. What do you make of this? What's the image of the Son of Man? How do you make sense of this? The beast is scary, Susan says, but there's a Son of Man. Absolutely. I think that's the hope that's given to us, that the kings of the earth will rise and wreak havoc, and yet eventually there is a Son of Man to whom will be given this dominion by God. Yes. I think we could say that the Son of Man is not God. The Son of the Man is presented to God, but if this is a mortal one, if this is just a human being, it's a curious role that this human being has. This human being is filling a role that isn't just a mere human authority. There's something semi-divine about it, that to him was given this everlasting dominion. What does that mean? Is that a Davidic image? Is that the throne of David will last forever kind of image? Or is this a strange figure that we're supposed to understand? I think the key to understanding this comes at the end in verse 18. The saints, the holy ones, what an interesting image. The holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and forever. There's a connection between the saints of the Most High and the Son of Man who is given this kingdom. It almost feels like the image in verses 13 and 14, the dream that Daniel is having, is of a human one being given this everlasting dominion. And yet the interpretation, right? Daniel has to ask one of the heavenly figures, what does all that stuff mean? And the response is, the four great beasts are the four kings who shall arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and forever. There's a sense in which that Son of Man represents God's saints, the holy ones, who have been persecuted by these beasts, who have lived under the terrible authority of these four earthly kings, and those who persist, those who remain faithful, those who are obedient, even in the face of suffering, they will be vindicated. They will be rescued. To them will be given the kingdom forever and ever. And so we see the Son of Man figure. We start to hear a lot of echoes from Jesus, right? Jesus's use of this Son of Man figure seems to be about himself, but also about the people he represents. I'll say a little bit more about that in a little bit, but let me just hold on to that for now. We'll come back to it. Susan suggests that, the Son of Man is the collective saved man or humanity. Yeah, I think that's right. I think Son of Man is an image in Daniel deeply of God's people also persisting. But in the dream, they're represented by a person. Dream interpretation is fascinating, isn't it? And the apocalyptic image, how in the world might God convey to God's people the magnitude of their suffering, the importance of their faithful obedience, and the promise of their vindication in a way that transcends any particular moment or generation? This story is an example. Remember, Daniel is a very late book, very late written. It's likely a second century BC, maybe even 300 years more recent than almost any other part of the Old Testament. So this has that kind of strange quality that we shouldn't be surprised to see emanating from Jesus's language, Jesus's speech. This is theology a lot closer. In the same way that if you wanted to know what people are eating, then you should probably look at a cookbook from the last 100 years. Because if you look at a cookbook from 600 years ago, there's a good chance that a lot of what we're eating is different. The same is true for theology. If you want to know how Jesus's contemporaries talked about God, you shouldn't go back to a text 1,000 years old that they might have quoted it. If you want to hear what they're saying, look at a text that was written closer to when Jesus was alive, like the book of Daniel. Let me now move us to a non-canonical text. This is from First Enoch, sometimes called the Similitudes of Enoch. It was written probably actually after the gospel accounts, but it is a Jewish text. Scholars believe it to be a Jewish text, not a Christian text, and it was written around the time that the gospel accounts were written. So this is contemporary theology when the gospels are being written. And so if we want to know kind of what they think of, what Jesus' contemporaries are thinking of Son of Man, this is another good place to look. And it's a really long text, but I'm going to read from just part of it called chapter 62, and listen to the Son of Man language and notice the connections. I realize we're going to run late, and if you got to go, I understand you got to go. You can always come back and watch later, but I've got about 5 or 7 more minutes. So if you're willing to hang on, hang on. We don't have an 11 o'clock service, so we can do that. So this is from chapter 62. And thus the Lord commanded the kings and the mighty and the exalted and those who dwell on the earth, and said, open your eyes and lift up your horns if ye are able to recognize the elect one. And the Lord of spirits seated him on the throne of his glory, and the spirit of righteousness was poured out upon him, and the word of his mouth slays all the sinners, and all the unrighteous are destroyed from before his face. And there shall stand up in that day all the kings and the mighty and the exalted and those who hold the earth, and they shall see and recognize how he sits on the throne of his glory, and his righteousness is judged before him, and no lying word is spoken before him. Then shall pain come upon them as on a woman in travail, and she has pain in bringing forth, when her child enters the mouth of the womb, and she has pain in bringing forth. One portion of them shall look on the other, and they shall be terrified, and they shall be downcast of countenance, and pain shall seize them when they see that Son of Man sitting on the throne of his glory. And the kings and the mighty and all who possess the earth shall bless and glorify and extol him who rules over all, who was hidden. For from the beginning the Son of Man was hidden, and the Most High preserved him in the presence of his might, and revealed him to the elect. And the congregation of the elect and holy shall be sown, and the elect shall stand before him on that day. I'm going to pause there, and let me note for you, gosh, isn't that familiar? Doesn't that sound like Mark 13? Doesn't that sound like Daniel 7? Right? All the kings, let me see where it was. The kings and the mighty and all who possess the earth shall bless and glorify him who extols, who rules over all. This Son of Man figure is a uniting figure. All the kings and authorities of the earth will bless, worship, praise him. Notice this is new. This pre-existent bit from the beginning, the Son of Man was hidden. That's a new layer, this kind of pre-existent bit that we hear in John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is a development. And so now we see this Son of Man, capital S, capital M, isn't just an ordinary person. It's a particular kind of person. If it's a person or a community or a nation or an apocalyptic figure, whatever it is, there's a pre-existent element to that. Isn't that curious? And so now we see in a Jewish text written 1st century AD, we also see in this some echoes of what we would call Christian theology, even if this isn't Christian theology. Yeah, and Susan notes what a beautiful and intense description of childbirth. Yes, and maybe a woman wrote this, or maybe someone who's more familiar with childbirth, right? Yeah, what an interesting image of pain and expectation that get wrapped together, right? Yeah. So let me Rebecca asked me a minute ago what book I was using. These are not books that I would recommend that you purchase. You are welcome, of course, to buy them. But this is the first book, The Origins of Christology by C.F.D. Mole. That's a book. And the second one is The Gospels and Jesus by Graham Stanton. Again, if you were interested in sort of writing a paper on Christology, they'd be good, and they're interesting to read. But I would think of them more as academic texts, but you're certainly welcome, of course, to buy them and peruse them. I'm not following them along, but they're texts that have kind of provided some structure for our class. So here's what I want to do as we wrap up. So we've got New Testament examples, we've got Old Testament examples. The question before us is, what does Son of Man mean? When we call Jesus the Son of Man, when Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, what are we supposed to be thinking of? What's the difference between Son of Man and Son of God? What does Son of Man mean? We'll talk about Son of God next week. Here are some possibilities. I have some favorites, and I have some versions that I don't like so much. I don't have an answer. Graham Stanton, I hope, he's dead now, I hope he would be delighted to know that his student is not attempting to provide an answer. But let me offer this. One school of thought is that Jesus didn't actually use the title for himself, but that the early church used it a lot, and they really liked it. And so when they quoted Jesus in the Gospels, they put Son of Man in there a lot. They loved it because Son of Man, with that Daniel 7 image and the first Enoch image, if you will, is an apocalyptic end of the world image. And the early Christians, we can tell, the early Christians, if you read Paul's writings, they were focused on the return of Christ. At any minute, Christ will come back. At any minute, the world will end. That apocalyptic fervor was really important in the early Christian tradition. So it's reasonable, they suggest, that the early church is the one who's primarily responsible for this Son of Man language. The problem is that Son of Man doesn't occur very often in Paul's writings. In fact, it doesn't occur at all in Paul's writings. Let me go back to this search. Notice, when we search for Son of God, over here on the right side of the screen, Matthew 29, Mark 14, Luke 26, John 13, Acts 1, and that's when Stephen sees the heavens open and says, I see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Father. Hebrews gives us one version, and Revelation, which perhaps not surprises us. There's not one letter of Paul. Not one time does Paul use the term Son of Man to describe Jesus. He uses the term Son of God a lot, but he doesn't use the term Son of Man. And there are no examples, zero examples of confessional documents from the early church, creedal statements, baptismal covenants. There are no examples where people were confessing Jesus as the Son of Man. So if the early church was responsible for it, why don't we have any evidence of it? There's no evidence that they used it except for what's in the gospel account. So it seems more likely that it originates with Jesus, that Jesus used this term. The question remains, what does Jesus mean by that? Some people think that he meant mortal, that every time authentic sayings of Jesus, things that Jesus actually said, not just things we kind of remember him saying with kind of, if you squint carefully, you might be able to see it. But when Jesus used Son of Man, what did he mean? And some people think that he just meant me, I. In Aramaic, Son of Man is a euphemism for I. Kind of like if I were to, my father's name is Doug. If I were to say, that son of Doug, that could mean me. It could be my brothers as well, but in this case, I mean me. That son of a human, maybe he just means himself. The problem with that, and that could be the case, we see foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Maybe he does just mean, I've got nowhere to lay my head, without any kind of connection beyond that. The problem is, Son of Man is pretty easy to say in Aramaic, but it's awkward in Greek. It's not an easy to write or say Greek phrase. So in the New Testament, why wouldn't they just say I? If Jesus was using this euphemism, but he only meant me, why not just use the Greek pronouns for me or for I? That's just so much clearer, ego. That's so much clearer than Son of Man. So the gospel writers seem to know that Jesus means something special by it. So we're left with a title that means something more than just mortal. But what does it mean? My favorite, I think, answer is by another Cambridge theologian named Morna Hooker, just a brilliant Pauline scholar, Morna Hooker. She uses that image of faithfulness now and vindicated later in order to convey it. She's the one who says Jesus didn't use this as a special title, but he used it as a concept for himself and for his ministry that signified that one who is faithful in the face of persecution now will ultimately be vindicated by God. So Morna Hooker claims that when Jesus talks about himself as the Son of Man, what he means is, I'm calling you to follow me as one who is obedient in the face of suffering, trusting that one day God will redeem us. That the term Son of Man to a first century Palestinian audience meant all of that, meant faithful, obedient in the face of suffering, and who hopes for future vindication. It didn't mean necessarily this divine figure who comes down and accomplishes all this, though perhaps we would say that Jesus embodies that, but that Jesus could use this title in a way to refer to that concept of today, suffering and obedience, tomorrow, someday, vindication. I like that. I think that fits really well with all the examples that we've seen, and I think fits well with the other examples. The last concept, and I don't think these are mutually exclusive, but the last sort of idea that I want to point us to is that collective identity. And I think there's a lot of fruit here as well, that when Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, he doesn't only mean individually. He means his identity as, to use Pauline language, as the new Adam, the perfect human, the one who is sent to restore humanity, the collective representative of all humanity, which is, so goes Jesus, so goes humanity. That allows him then to refer to himself with these kind of high Christology titles, Messiah, a special import. Jesus is able to talk about himself and his ministry as being significant, unique, and special without importing upon himself some of the Christos, Kyrios titles, Christ and Lord titles that we might sort of separate out as a later development. Jesus isn't quoted in the Gospels as calling himself Messiah or Son of God, and yet he does call himself Son of Man. And because of that corporate identity, we're able to start to make the connection, that kind of bridge language. And I want to read from you a quote from a theologian named Caird, G.B. Caird, C-A-I-R-D, that's quoted in Charlie Moll's book, The Origins of Christology. And I think this is a really beautiful way to sum up for us Son of Man. The use of the title Son of Man, he writes, enabled Jesus, without actually claiming to be Messiah, to indicate his essential unity with mankind, and above all with the weak and humble, and also his special function as predestined representative of the new Israel and bearer of God's judgment and kingdom. Essential unity with humankind, and in particular with the humility and the suffering of God's people. This Son of Man concept, one who suffers in the face of obedience, doesn't just mean one, it means the saints of God, the holy ones of God, as we see in Daniel 7. Daniel 7, probably the principal text that Jesus has in mind when he calls himself Son of Man. And yet the beauty of that text is that it's not about Superman coming with his cape. It's about God's people being faithful. And Jesus becomes the one who represents the many, the one who suffers on behalf of the many. The many are not called to an easy breezy existence. They are likewise called to suffer, but the many are able to see in the life and suffering and death and resurrection of Jesus their own path of suffering, struggle, death, and resurrection, being true to that theological image of Daniel 7, without needing it to be an explicitly Jesus-centered or Christian text. I love that. So that's what I've got for today. We've gone way over now, 13 minutes. I lied to you when I said 4 or 5. We've gone way over, but I hope it's been valuable for you. If you've got a question or a comment, I hope you'll share it. As we wrap up, Susan notes, Jesus referring to himself as Son of Man as mortal and one of the numbers of men. Jesus was too humble to refer to himself as a savior, not even sure he knew until the end. Yeah, I think you're right. There's a one question about Christology is, what did Jesus actually know? What did Jesus know about himself? And we'll talk about that particularly next week and in the weeks that follow. Son of God, what does it mean to be a son of God? What did Jesus think of when he heard the phrase Son of God? Did Jesus think of himself as the Son of God, as a Son of God, as none of the above, as both? Yeah, absolutely. So Jesus, whether humble, whether only willing to share what the people could understand at the time, or whether he was perhaps in his human way ignorant of the fullness of that truth, the study of Christology is to dig right into that. What was going on in the mind of Jesus? What was going on in the minds of the people who knew him physically? And how did that become what we acclaim about Jesus in faith? I hope the Son of Man conversation has been helpful for you. I've learned a lot, and I think Graham Stanton would be pleased that we tackled it without trying to overdo it. I feel like I can go back and do a better job in that sermon now. But it's been good to be with you all. Thank you all for being present. Next week, Son of God. Let's close our time now by saying together the prayer that Jesus has taught us. Let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.